So we had a really interesting discussion about the Dove ad. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the reasons that I chose that particular example. Partly, I mean, in fact, I think the main reason why I chose it is that I feel like we get this sort of message about viral media or like different, like what viral media is from Spreadability that really suggests that like this isn't something that's very common. I think that the Dove ad is actually an example of, or at least what many media marketers would take to be an example of highly successful modern media practices. That what you're doing, and this is actually, I was really glad that Natalie had shared that YouTube video. It's something that the author of Contagious is talking about with like, why people get, like why information is spread and how you can sort of be a successful, like how you can be successful at branding. And one of the things that he says is like you can do this like really compelling story, and as long as you can, like if you can kind of find a way to insert your own brand's kind of image in there, like your own branding, then that's really powerful. I think of this actually as kind of, at least it's interesting to think about it as a kind of Trojan horse. Although we can talk more about like when that's sort of appropriate in a little bit. But I think that actually this is so much an example of the kind of success, like what people are sort of aiming at when they're engaging in media practices, particularly different kinds of branding online today. The idea, there's a lot of discussion of creating a digital presence, thinking about sort of value adding and storytelling, and finding a way to kind of insert your own brand into that so that people have the sort of like warm, fuzzy associations with your brand or with your products, things like that, right? So this is really what people are trying to do. And in that sense, I think it's really fascinating because I also think that the Dove ad is in some cases also an example of sort of like the sort of, this is what you shouldn't do, because it also really illustrates, I think, a particular kind of tension that I think the authors of Spreadable Media are talking about in the chapter on, where Web 2.0 went wrong, right? So they're highlighting here this tension between different kinds of participatory culture, which tends to be governed by a particular kind of moral economy, which is much more about social sharing. And then thinking about different kinds of capitalist values and trying to have gains for profit. So the idea is that insofar at like why it's so successful and also why it illustrates this sort of tension is that what's happening in the Dove ad is a sense where like you're saying X or you're doing this thing, and in doing so, like the sort of the content that's being shared or like what's happening is this kind of like there's a story or there's a message, but that in so doing, you're actually trying to sort of subsume this under some sort of broader aim that may or may not be consistent with the message, like with what's within the message. So I think what's so upsetting, or at least like when we think about it, about the Dove ad or what can be, is that seems to be this tension between what they're trying to do ultimately, which is kind of like make you like Dove and make you feel like you need beauty products and you should buy them, right? Like you should buy their beauty products. And the message maybe of the ad, which is that like, oh, you're beautiful, you're fine the way you are. So in that sense, you could imagine that like there's this tension in the message, and that's kind of what we latch onto and why we think of it as being kind of like, wait a minute. That's not right. But it's really interesting to think about this as a kind of example or case study of lots of things that are happening in digital, like the way we engage with digital products or like the way we make digital posts. Because I think there's an argument to be made that something very similar is happening when people are posting things to, say, Instagram or Facebook, that you may be posting a message that has like a particular kind of content and a very explicit content and message, but that what you are trying to do or what you are trying to signal with that message or accomplish with it is different. And in some cases that can just sort of be like a sort of, well, it's like, and you're doing this, but there's nothing inconsistent about what's going on. Or it can be a case where maybe there's a tension here. And I think that when we think about digital media, we're starting to get really careful and like really sort of latch on to this kind of inconsistency between the content or sort of like the sort of explicitness, like what's explicitly part of the message, and what we think someone is doing with that message, right? Like, why did they post it? What's going on? You know, so we had someone was commenting on the voice thread that like, well, yeah, you always have to be asking yourself that of different kinds of advertisements. And I think it's really interesting because I think you could say the same thing about any kind of post on Facebook or Instagram or what have you. I wanted to highlight a couple of different things about this though too, because I feel like, you know, we don't necessarily need to you know, like we can sort of point out this tension between, you know, like doing something for a profit. Like, you know, we can say like, oh, well, they posted this or they created this ad or they did this thing and it had all these messages in it, but what they were really trying to do was make a profit. And I think sometimes we can have this disconnect, as in the Dove ad, between the messages, and then it just feels like really like inauthentic and like manipulative. But I also think that like sometimes this can cut in the opposite direction, where I feel like we can think about the reasons why preschool teachers or doulas or other different kinds of like professions are sort of not well paid. And I think a lot of it, and like teachers just sort of generally, there's this sense that like, well, you're not in it for the money, right? And so there's recently been, I think, in many different kinds of professions, this sort of push to be like, well, yes, what we do is valuable and we do what we do because we really care about it, but also, could you pay us a living wage? And this is sort of, I think, something that is happening with sort of like different kinds of like free economies and like online gifting. And there are these real sorts of questions about whether that works. But I think a lot of these questions are very salient to like they're like these different kinds of economic models are really working sort of like in the underground, or sort of like they're motivating different kinds of strategies for sending out information. And it's really interesting to think about what kinds of models we are working with as we're thinking about this stuff. Also, I was not sure, we did have, so Felicia mentioned one of the Super Bowl ads, but I was kind of curious whether people had watched the Super Bowl, and I always watch it in part too because I think one of the differences between Super Bowl ads of now and in the past is that Super Bowl ads tend to be, I think, they're like designed to be shared online. So the idea is that even if you weren't watching the Super Bowl, they're designed to spark conversation. They're sort of like attention getting, and the idea is that even if you didn't see it sort of like at the Super Bowl itself, you could still watch the ad later and share it through social media, and people will be like talking about it because it's a big event. So I was curious if anybody had any other comments about that as well.